Today's occurrence happened in New Orleans, Louisiana, and is part 3 of the stories of Hurricane Katrina. If you haven't listened to those, go get caught up now so you aren't confused. They are the 2 episodes right before this one. And just to recap, when we left off in part 2, life care patients and memorial patients were being euthanized or straight up killed inside a Memorial Medical Center by Dr. John Thiel, Dr. Anna Poe, and others. But I haven't said the details of all of that yet. Those not actively participating were turning a blind eye, and although they later claimed to be upset, as I'll explain, they ultimately didn't stop it. African Americans were being murdered for trying to make it to safety in Algiers Point by white residents and dragged in the media that incited hysteria for alleged looting, while white residents were portrayed as just grabbing survival items. Some hospitals like Charity, while abandoned and treated terribly by rescue organizers, went through great efforts to keep patients alive throughout the disaster, and compared to many organizations I'll get to, they did phenomenal. Now, just a reminder, all of this, in this part and in parts 1 and 2, are all sourced from publicly available information, but obviously do your own research, form your own opinions, as I am retelling what happened as best I can in a condensed story-type format for easy listening. As always, I'm Tatiana, and these are the stories of Hurricane Katrina. Herbert Freeman Jr., who originally rode out Hurricane Katrina with his bedridden mother at home, but was forced to leave when the water started rising, made it to the Superdome on September 1st. That same day, while waiting at the Superdome, his mom kept asking where they were. Herbert kept telling her that they were at the Superdome with everyone else because they were trying to evacuate because of the hurricane. She would ask him what the plan was for all these people, and he told her that they were supposed to have buses coming. But there was no sign of buses. All of the noise and people were starting to get to his mother. There were thousands of them, and she wasn't in the best of health, so Herbert asked a policeman for more information. He needed to know when he could get his mom out of this heat and checked over at the very least. The officer told him to take all of her stuff and roll her in her wheelchair outside to the end of the line so that when the buses came from that direction, she would be the first to load up. So that's what they did, and Herbert kept checking on his mom. Every time he went to check on her, he would ask if the buses had come, and the officer would tell him that they hadn't come yet. His mother was sitting in her wheelchair and would ask Herbert questions every 5 minutes or so. At one point, the pause went longer, 10 to 15 minutes. So Herbert looked up since she was in a wheelchair and he was sitting on the curb lower, and it looked like she was asleep. Herbert went to shake his mother just to see if she was in fact asleep because usually she would not just fall asleep if she was in the wheelchair. But she didn't respond. It was later in the evening when this happened, so he just kind of sat there processing. His mom just died in a wheelchair sitting outside of the Superdome, waiting on buses that didn't show up in time. Waiting on the same buses that in part 2, those waiting where Denise was at, were continuously told to line up for the buses every 4 hours. While he was sitting there, a guy came up to Herbert and told him to cover his mother. So they ended up covering her with a poncho, and someone else let them know that they were actually moving the people dying while waiting into a doorway kind of off to the side and out of sight. Herbert left a note in his mother's hand that had his name, his relation to her, and his contact information for whenever people would get to her so they could let him know where she would be moved to. Herbert kind of thought they were going to put his mom in a freezer that was there or just something, but the electricity was off, so she was just left outside. Buses didn't come until 4 days later, on September 4th. His mother died on the 1st. He left on the 4th, and she was still there in the heat. He wanted to stay with his mom, but the National Guard ordered him onto the bus and told him that he was just doing his job. Herbert asked the guy to just go and see her again, just one more time before he left, and the officer told him, "No, you're going to get on this bus and stay on the bus." So basically, Herbert had to pick between just leaving it alone for now and trying to handle it a little better later on, or going against this officer with an AK-47. Something told him to just get on the bus and not do anything too wild, and he couldn't have been more right to listen to that instinct. Also on September 4th, New Orleans Police Department officers could hear their radios report that officers were under fire near the Danziger Bridge. Officers listening claimed that they could hear people screaming, gunshots, and officers calling for assistance all over the radio. It reportedly sounded like World War III. By the end of whatever happened on the bridge, by the time the gunfire stopped, 6 people would be shot by police. 2 of those people did not survive. Officers and politicians alike are so happy at this point because finally they got the bad guy instead of the officers feeling like they were being targeted. Because reportedly there was one officer killed at the Superdome or convention center, so to officers it was like they got their lick back at this point. You know, who cares if those people were shot? They shot at officers first on the bridge. At least those were the feelings following the incident. And the feelings that would linger around that incident and several others like it for several years until the truth of what happened on that bridge and to what happened to other New Orleanians was revealed. There were several questionable police shootings in the weeks after the storm, at least 10 on record, and several cover-ups. One instance was on September 1st, same day as a million other terrible things happening around New Orleans, like dark cannon events or something. A SWAT team was camped out at a local school, Habens Elementary School. Allegedly, a Captain Jeff Wynn and Lieutenant Dwayne Sherman were told that someone hijacked a water truck and that they were robbing, raping, and killing people. Both officers saw 3 water trucks near the Superdome and saw a man near that truck with a gun when they responded to the call. Both officers just shot the guy in the torso. That guy that they shot was Keenan McCannon, and when he was apprehended, there was no gun on him. Keenan survived, but police claimed he must have threw the weapon off the overpass that they were on. Police brought Keenan to the hospital, then they cut him loose and set him free. Which was curious because if they believed he was actually the guy or actually had a gun, they would not have just let him go. He never had charges against him. In fact, he wasn't alone on the bridge when police showed up and shot him. Keenan was with his family. His sister was there too and said that they were all stranded there. Keenan didn't have a gun. The day before that, Danny Brumfield was shot in the back at the convention center by a police officer under questionable circumstances. There was also a Matthew McDonald who was shot and killed in an intersection by the French Quarter by one shot to the back. A day after that water truck shooting, another recorded case of suspicious police activity happened. A man named Henry Glover, who lived in Algiers, went to go grab food and water with someone at a strip mall nearby. Sometime after Henry left, his brother, Edward, heard someone yelling for him and saying that someone shot Henry. So Edward went to run and find Henry. They found him about 50 yards from the strip mall, bleeding from his chest. Edward waved down a car that was driving by with a man named Will Tanner behind the wheel. Will stopped because Edward was yelling about someone needing medical attention and could see Henry on the ground, so Will went to check Henry's pulse as he laid there, and he still had a pulse. So realizing Henry was alive, Will agreed to drive the men for help. Edward pulled Henry into the back seat with him. Will thought the closest hospital was still too far and didn't think Henry would make it, so he drove a mile to Habens Elementary School. Will knew police were camped out there. He didn't know about what had happened the day before or the truth about who actually shot Henry. Edward thought that they would get help when they got to the school. After all, they are first responders, and if they didn't have the medical help on location, they could expedite getting Henry help. But the first thing officers did was put Edward and Will in handcuffs. Now, Edward, he was confused because they weren't helping them, they weren't helping his brother. So Edward questioned police on why they wouldn't help. And I guess it triggered the officers because they started beating him and Will. Edward said that he had never been beaten like that in his entire life. Like, the guy said he grew up in the projects and fought like 3 times a day, but never got beat, how the officer, he later identified as Lieutenant Dwayne Sherman, beat him. Like, Edward's hands were handcuffed behind him while he got hit, kicked, spit on, everything, so he couldn't defend himself. When he first got hit, he faked like he was knocked out, but the officer yelled at him to get up and grabbed him by the front of his throat, like by his Adam's apple, and let go right before Edward blacked out. Will was kicked several times and hit in the face with an assault rifle. The entire time officers are beating these guys, Henry Glover is in the car bleeding with no one bothering to check on him. Will and Edward are beaten to pulps on the ground when they see an officer get in the car and drive off with Henry still in the back seat. That was the last time Edward saw his brother. Now, Dwayne Sherman, an officer part of the water truck response and this alleged beating, was actually second in command of the New Orleans SWAT team. Inside the department, Dwayne's status was legendary. He was a cop's cop to the T, he was described as fearless, courageous, etc. And ironically enough, his interview with Frontline, who did the follow-up piece I'm referencing for suspicious police investigations with A.C. Thompson's evidence, also labeled Dwayne as such at first. In the interview, Dwayne talked about how he and other officers saw the roof coming off the Superdome and how police got reports that people needed help. Dwayne and other officers were seen as heroes because they went and took fishing boats, personal and otherwise, to go rescue people. He helped punch people out of the attics they were trapped in while the flood was almost up to the roof of those homes. Some of these incidents wouldn't even be looked into for years, in part because of cover-ups. Now, in part 2, I went over most of the general memorial staff and patients' evacuations. Allegedly, staff and their family members were leaving Memorial well before the last living patients went out. And allegedly, Dr. Anna Poe and other staff euthanized patients before evacuating themselves, before even the last living patient had been rescued from the hospital. But 50 staff and family members stayed at Memorial overnight Thursday, September 1st. They slept on the helipad, and Incident Commander Susan Muldrick and ICU nurse manager Karen Wynn were among that group. While they were all up there, no one went back into the hospital. Armed staff guarded the staircases. And when a group of people were suddenly seen in the hospital window, including children, the employees threatened to shoot the, quote, looters if they came any closer. The next morning, September 2nd, Karen Wynn was flown by helicopter to the New Orleans airport. There, she could see Memorial ICU patient 300-plus pound Rodney Scott sitting in his wheelchair in a paper gown, shivering out on the concourse. If you don't remember, Rodney was a licensed practical nurse and the patient that was evacuated last from the hospital because staff were worried he would get stuck in the hole in the wall that they passed the patients through on their way to the helipad. A lot of hospital patients in general ended up in these positions. At other hospitals, many ended up in airports or wherever they had been evacuated to. In part 2, I also mentioned some Memorial staff who were able to leave the airports they were dropped at well ahead of others who had allegedly been through a more harrowing ordeal. In Susan's case, it was because she and a few of her colleagues were asked to take care of people at the airport they ended up at, and an officer felt bad for them and got them seats on a plane quickly. Well, Susan would later discover that several hospital officials were actually taken to another Tenet hospital after leaving Memorial and given a room to shower, shave, change, and given a hot meal. Then those officials were flown by helicopter to Mississippi before getting onto a private jet to wherever they preferred to go, including CFO Curtis Stott, whose wife did not want the man on a bus with everyone else. Other staff flown to Tenet hospitals were given ride to Dallas, Texas on pretty decent buses where they stayed in reserved upscale rooms, complete with free food vouchers, toiletry amenity packs, and help getting back into contact with their relatives. On Sunday, September 11th, more than a week after the last of Memorial's dwellers departed, 45 bodies were discovered in the hospital's hallways, morgues, chapel, life care floor, and emergency room. The largest number of bodies found at any nursing home or hospital hit by Katrina by a lot. Several hospital workers at Memorial were very upset with the amount of patient deaths, especially the injections. So, reporters heard hints of what happened pretty fast. On Monday, September 19th, Dr. Anna Poe called Susan Mulderick after reading that the state was investigating the deaths at Memorial Medical Center. Anna had also been contacted by major news networks wanting to report on possible euthanasia at the hospital and wanted her side of the story. Anna didn't know what to do, so she called Susan. Susan told her to wait, and someone from Tenet would call her. Susan wouldn't be the only Memorial employee Anna spoke to, though. Before Susan, she called John Walsh, the hospital's surgery department chair. On September 1st, she spoke to him about what happened on the 7th floor, where she allegedly injected patients and many died. John told her to get an attorney ASAP, contact Memorial CEO Renee Gu, and be honest. She wasn't able to reach him, though, after leaving several messages. She had also spoken to pulmonologist Dr. Ewing Cook before calling Susan. He's allegedly the guy who told her what drugs to give patients, and she wanted to know if anyone had contacted him. Ewing told her he had been contacted, but he wanted nothing to do with it. He didn't want to be known. He didn't want to deal with people's opinions on the ethics of what happened. He told Anna to keep her mouth shut when it came to the media and hide. Renee wasn't the person to get back in contact with Anna from the hospital. Tenet's corporate communications director, Stephen Campanini, was. He would talk to Anna with Audrey Andrews on the same phone call, too. She was Tenet's assistant general counsel. Audrey told Anna she represented the company, not people, and for Anna to get her own attorney and maybe come up with a statement for the media. The next day, Anna would read Stephen and Audrey that statement that they told her to write, and they told her, actually, don't send that to the media. Anna ended up getting a criminal and civil defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crimes, Richard Simmons Jr. Richard, by all appearances, seemed like the guy to go to allegedly try to get away with whatever it is you did. He successfully helped with defending a business partner of one of Louisiana's most corrupt governors, Edwin Edwards, in a racketeering case. He helped with the representation of a Lieutenant William Calley on an appeal in the My Lai massacre case. If you're not familiar, that massacre was a United States war crime, when we mass murdered unarmed civilians in a South Vietnamese village during the Vietnam War. Anywhere from 350 to a bit over 500 civilians, mostly children, women, and elderly men, were murdered by U.S. military. Women were gang raped, mutilated. The same thing happened to children as young as 12 years old. That's as much as I'll say, because it honestly makes me sick to my stomach to talk about, but I think it paints a pretty decent picture of what happened during that massacre and the kind of lawyer Richard is to be on the lieutenant's defense team. Anna was advised to hire him from her employer, Louisiana State University Healthcare Network, or LSU. Because Dr. Anna Poe wasn't exactly an employee of Memorial Medical Center, at least not in the way that many other staff members were. After getting her degree and working for a few years at hospitals in Texas, she was hired by LSU. You see, at several national meetings in Anna's specialty, she developed a friendly relationship with the head of otolaryngology at Louisiana State University, Dr. Daniel Nuss. One of Daniel's brothers dated one of Anna's sisters as well. Daniel's private practice was located at Memorial Medical Center, and he treated head and neck cancers just like Anna. Daniel's program that focused on tumors and reconstruction also treated patients at Charity Hospital. Now, Anna and her family were from New Orleans, born and raised, so after several asks by Daniel and the department Anna worked in, heading in a new direction due to leadership change, she said yes to his offer. LSU was her employer and provided her liability insurance. Memorial Medical Center advanced LSU over $300,000 to pay for Anna's first-year salary and expenses against her future earnings as a surgeon. Because of that, Anna would join Memorial staff and see patients in their emergency room when she was on call without extra pay. Now, this benefited Memorial in ways that will make sense when I explain behind-the-scenes discussions and decisions in another part, but by having a university physician on staff, Memorial now qualified as a teaching hospital and could access additional Medicare funding. Anna started seeing patients in New Orleans in October of 2004, less than a year before Katrina hit. Now, being her official employer, LSU Healthcare Network agreed to cover attorney Richard's cost at $275 an hour. Richard got to work. Anna wasn't to speak about what happened to anyone, including her husband, who would later go on to say that he wished he knew what Anna and Richard talked about because they spoke every day. And he didn't know any details, really, of what happened in that hospital. Now, Richard worked to bury Anna's conversations with Stephen and Audrey during that phone call. And for the sake of not repeating myself too much, Anna's lawyer would deny much of what others claimed Anna said or did in regards to pretty much everything that sounds like something sketchy that happens with patients going forward, and even in previous parts of this series, to be honest. Now, while Richard and Anna were working to keep her out of the public's crosshairs, at the same time, investigations all over New Orleans were happening, not just into Memorial, into other healthcare facilities I'll elaborate on a bit later. Prosecutor Butch Schaefer and Special Agent Virginia Ryder were tasked with investigating several healthcare facilities. Attorney General Charles Fody tasked his Medicaid Fraud Control Unit with investigating every single nursing home or hospital where patients died. That unit was funded through federal and state funds and oversaw any healthcare facility that participated in Medicaid. So a ton of complaints were pouring into the Attorney General's office alleging all sorts of crimes at nursing homes and hospitals throughout New Orleans. LifeCare asked their employees to be honest and upfront with investigators, and to an extent, it kind of appeared that they were. Some of the truth about the deaths at Memorial were told to investigators at first. LifeCare's assistant administrator, pregnant Diane Robichaud, allegedly claimed LifeCare staff were using gravity-dripping IVs on patients, even though the rest of the hospital really wasn't. Diane confessed that Susan Muldrick is the one who told her and two other nurses that the plan was not to leave any living patients behind. That when Diane spoke to Dr. Anna Poe, Anna pretty much told her those patients weren't going to survive or something like that, and that Diane needed to decide if she wanted her staff on the floor for it or not. Diane didn't want her staff on the floor for what was going to happen, and when Diane spoke to LifeCare nurse executive Therese Mendez, Therese said Anna told her a decision had been made to administer lethal doses to these patients. Diane said when she told Anna about Emmett Everett, the 380-pound paralyzed and very aware of his surroundings patient, Anna told her she didn't know any of the patients were even conscious. There was some back and forth between them and two other nurses present about if they would be able to evacuate him, if people could actually get him down the stairs and lift him through the hole in the wall. They didn't think it was possible. So Anna asked Diane if they had a staff member willing to go in and sedate him, a staff member that would be comfortable and familiar to Emmett. That's when they suggested someone ask Andre Gremillon to be the one to do it. Diane could just tell when they asked him, he wasn't going to do it. And that's what caused Andre to leave the room upset in part 2, them asking him to sedate Emmett so that they could euthanize him. When Diane got her staff and left the floor, Anna stopped her and told her that she knew this was hard for LifeCare staff and she didn't want anyone to feel responsible because it had nothing to do with LifeCare. Anna told Diane she took full responsibility for it and didn't want anybody to worry about their licenses or something along those lines. Over the next few days, after being evacuated from Memorial, LifeCare leaders would be called to the company's headquarters in Texas for counseling. After Labor Day, life care lawyers brainstormed the best way to self-report what had been discovered of the potentially criminal events to government officials with the offer of full cooperation. Allegedly, they hoped being proactive and self-reporting would save them from criminal charges. Diane would just so happen to be in the room when Dr. John Skinner, Memorial's pathologist, called to share the names of all the patients he documented as deceased. In those names were all 9 patients on Life Care's 7th floor and more that Life Care staff didn't even know died. When investigators spoke to Therese Mendez, she said on the morning of September 1st, the hospital was just getting one helicopter right after the other. The air was filled with them. When she went to check on Life Care patients later that morning, they didn't look good, but they were alive. She remembered being summoned to speak with Dr. Anna Poe and others, and after agreements that the patients wouldn't survive, Anna said the decision had been made to administer lethal doses of morphine and Ativan. Therese asked if that plan only applied to Life Care patients, and Anna told her no. Another Life Care leader, physical medicine director Christy Johnson, would recall hearing Susan Muldrick telling them to speak to Anna and that no living patients would be left behind. She remembered a chaotic evacuation as she ran up to get Angela, Wilda McManus's daughter, from where she was at and out to a boat. Then she remembered Therese Mendez yelling for her and grabbing her before running back up the stairs with her while Therese told her their patients were going to be given a lethal dose. It made Christy stop in her tracks to hear that, but she knew they were under martial law, and she figured the lethal dose had been ordered. Life Care pharmacist Stephen Harris said similar. Susan told him to talk to Anna, and Anna used the phrase lethal dose for what would be given to patients. He recalled Diane telling Anna that Emmett was aware of what was happening at the hospital, and Anna asking someone to talk to him or sedate him, and the nurse they asked refusing to do it. After Anna and 2 nurses, allegedly Sherry Landry and Lori Boudreau, visited, Stephen was asked to help check on patients and cover those who had died. Stephen was the same pharmacist tasked with bringing the anti-anxiety meds to that nurse losing it in the parking garage. Essentially, after speaking with Life Care witnesses, they pretty much all alleged that Dr. Anna Poe had gone up to the 7th floor to euthanize the 9 remaining patients up there, and 2 specifically remembered her saying that her intention was to be lethal. All of those patients did end up dying. During the course of the investigation, prosecutor Butch Schaefer and Special Agent Virginia Ryder visited the hospital to try and gather records and evidence. Investigators had requested records after the storm, but Tenet, Memorial's parent company, did not send all of what they asked for. Allegedly, what was sent was incomplete or just not there altogether. The records they wanted had been taken to another Tenet hospital, and the incomplete files they would eventually get in October missed a lot of information. But inside of the hospital, they did find papers that listed everyone present in Memorial during Katrina by department. Tenet, the parent company, had also refused to allow Life Care representatives to enter the hospital in the weeks after the storm. During that time, computer servers, computer tapes, and certain patient records had gone missing. Life Care nurses' lockers were cut open and their property inside had been removed. Life Care would end up filing a restraining order and injunction against Tenet wanting the materials returned. Now, the smell of death was absolutely everywhere in Memorial when Butch, Virginia, and their team went to check it out, to the point where, once it was smelled, investigators said they could never forget it. They had to use a battering ram to breach Memorial and Life Care's pharmacies, where they found pharmacy records that included those 3 prescriptions for huge amounts of morphine dated for September 1st, 2005, and signed by Dr. Anna Poe. They found boxes of morphine ampules on the nursing station and a desk that was just below windows facing the helipad, out in the open instead of locked away. They found a translucent bag that one witness claimed to have seen Anna, and the nurses walking around with, it was full of syringes. In the second floor lobby, there were multiple morphine vials and boxes on a tray out in the open. There were syringes, vials, and medical waste everywhere it shouldn't have been. Butch was shook to see that, contrary to many news stories saying the hospital ran out of food and water, there were canned goods in the kitchen, food and beverages scattered and stashed all through the hospital, and water bottles stacked to the ceiling. Like no one had even been desperate enough to empty even one vending machine. And if they were truly starving and thirsty, they would have done so. There was more supplies in Memorial to consume than the thousands there got around to consuming. When piecing together evacuation paths and steps taken according to testimonials, investigators were confused to see that staff used the hole in the machine wall on the second floor to move patients to the parking garage. They couldn't understand why they didn't just choose a simpler way, including just walking across the rooftop directly from the 7th floor, the life care floor. I don't know if there was a door exit there, but considering they had been busting out windows all over the rest of the hospital because of the heat, it's a wonder why they didn't just do the same thing there, where they would have been able to walk across the roof to get to the helipad. It would have been less work than having to move the patients up and down the stairs to get to that machine room, especially considering the hassle moving patients was to them, according to what they said. It was allegedly half the reason the staff chose to euthanize people. Virginia noticed the hospital's main generators were sitting way above flood levels to the point where she thought that they were actually functional. She couldn't understand why the staff hadn't figured out how to bypass the submerged parts of the electrical system, because that's what was underwater, parts that could be bypassed, not the actual generators. In fact, it will later be revealed that not everyone in Memorial was even without power. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll explain that more when it's time. Now, when it came to the autopsies, Dr. Frank Minyard was the Orleans Parish coroner. He told Virginia Ryder that he thought it was useless to examine the bodies from Memorial. They had decomposed in the heat for over a week before they were recovered from the hospital. And remember, Frank is the coroner from Part 1 that I mentioned was blocking autopsy records that were related to the race killings and things of that nature, and had to be sued to release the information. Now, Virginia and Butch thought that this may derail their ability to prove a crime had occurred, but a volunteer pathologist told Virginia that what Frank said wasn't exactly right. If those people had been drugged, the drugs would still be left in their hardier tissues, like the muscles, brain, or the liver, or even the fluids that pool in the abdomen after death. Allegedly, Frank was a bit resentful while agreeing to request help with those autopsies from a federal disaster mortuary team. That team took samples from all the nursing home and hospital patients that died in Orleans Parish after Katrina. On October 6th, about 2 weeks after samples had been flown to be tested for detectable levels of sedatives and morphine, of the 18 cases that were sent, 9 were positive for morphine and about 6 or more popped positive for midazolam or Versed. When speaking with the guy who told Butch and Virginia this information, they asked him, can you walk us through what this means? Because we are not medical professionals. So the guy tells them, and I'm putting several direct quotes together as one because they were asking questions for clarity in between this. But he said, quote, morphine, obviously you've heard of. Midazolam is the brand named Versed, and it belongs to what's known as the class of compounds called benzodiazepines. And the one you are most familiar with in that family would be Valium. But the difference here is that midazolam is not a compound that people are routinely put on. It's a compound generally used in operating suites or when someone is going to be intubated. Someone may be given midazolam, but it's not one of these compounds that you'll find somebody getting a prescription for at home. Certainly the midazolam I'm finding is a little bit disconcerting, but I understand the difficulty. medical records are going to be very, very important now. Unless somebody is consistently being intubated and extubated or consistently going into the operating suite, there would be no reason for somebody to accumulate midazolam over periods of time. Morphine, certainly you can accumulate over time. But the concentrations we're finding, and you have to understand that the specimens we have, again, aren't exactly ideal. Some of the concentrations with morphine that we're finding they're pretty darn high. He also said that the lab detected several common medicines in the bodies, which was expected, including antidepressants and drugs for gastric reflux. The 9 people found with morphine were Harold Dupas, Hollis Alford, Wilda McManus, Elaine Nelson, Emmett Everett, Alice Hutzler, Rose Savoy, Aretha Watson, and George Hurd. It felt validating to investigators to hear that information. The 9 people that were listed were the exact same people on the attorney's list of suspicious deaths. They had both drugs in their system, and the lab hadn't even been given a slight hint as to who investigators suspected were killed. So they knew they could trust those results. Dr. Bryant King would come forward and tell investigators that the man he pronounced dead early Thursday morning made the 6th person who was placed in the chapel. After that, he would swear on his grave that nobody else died in the 2nd floor area he was in before he left the hospital between 12:30 and 1:30. The total number of dead patients in Memorial was like 21 tops when he left. Hearing the news reports that there were 45 bodies shocked him. It was way too many people that died in the time frame of him leaving and the next day. Bryant went on to say that the people were sick, but not sick enough for 20 of them to die collectively. He said, quote, "I mean, come on. What hospital loses 20 patients in a day? I mean, really. If you lose 20 patients in a day, somebody is going to come investigating because there's something abnormal going on." End quote. Bryant told Virginia and Butch they should talk to the person in charge, Susan. He said that Susan conducted every meeting, not the CEO. He said he didn't really know Susan, just her first name, and he described her. But when she walked into a room, everyone responded to her. If she said, "Okay, let's go ahead and get started," absolutely everybody shut up and started that meeting. Bryant confessed to his conversation with Dr. Kathleen Fournier, who told him about the conversation with Susan and Anna about ending patient suffering. He said Kathleen told him Anna said that she didn't have a problem with it. Investigators asked him why he didn't question what was being discussed. Bryant said he didn't think his opinion would actually make a difference. He was wary of everyone inside of the hospital, while everyone else inside claimed to be scared of anyone outside of it. He worried that with everyone being turned away from the hospital and him already arguing with the CEO to let people in, they might throw him out into that water if he kept stirring the pot. There was armed security everywhere. They could have removed him for sure, and he was the newbie, the most recent doctor hire. Growing up in East Chicago taught him when to speak his mind and when to keep his mouth closed. Bryant did text his friend and relatives saying that evil entities were planning to euthanize patients. He couldn't call them people anymore. Humans don't do that to each other. They don't kill people who have done nothing wrong. Once you talk about doing that to Bryant, you can no longer be called human. When Bryant described that day, he recalled that conversation with Dr. Kathleen Fournier and telling her he disagreed. He then helped with patient evacuations by carrying them to the parking garage. And when he came back to the 2nd floor, the helpers that were fanning the patients prior had been told to leave and were gone. Someone came and asked Bryant if he wanted to join them to pray, and he was like, "No, why would I do that for no reason? It's noon on a Thursday and we've never prayed before. Like, why?" Then he saw Dr. Anna Poe with a handful of a certain type of syringe, while she told a patient, "I'm going to give you something to make you feel better." Bryant went on to say, quote, "I don't know what was in the syringes. I don't know why she had them because we don't ever inject anybody if we don't have to. I mean, call a nurse to do that. We don't do it. Not to say it that way, but that's how we function." End quote. It was highly unusual for a doctor to handle syringes because the responsibility was divided. The doctor's order was checked by a pharmacist, which would be checked again by a nurse. And even though Bryant said that the whole formal structure of the hospital had broken down prior to this and was no longer acting like a hospital, it wasn't until this moment that, looking back, that system of quality control and medical formality broke down. Now, Bryant hadn't seen Dr. Anna Poe inject the patients, but when pieced together, everything felt obvious. The earlier conversations, random prayer sessions on a Thursday, Anna walking around with handfuls of syringes, which was already out of place. But they also hadn't even been giving medicine to patients that way. It just wasn't right. In fact, it was wrong. Bryant didn't know who decided it, the why or the how, but he knew family members deserved answers after losing loved ones due to whatever decisions were made. On October 12, 2005, an interview Dr. Bryant King did before he did that interview with investigators aired on a major news network. He said practically the same information in that interview as he said with investigators, but he left out names in the news interview. Another nurse part of that news segment said that they heard talk of euthanasia, but blew it off because of who told her. The person she described telling her was Dr. Kathleen Fournier. Stories of what had allegedly happened at Memorial ran in the news well before and after that piece ran. The media again sensationalizing things. Nancy Grace asking a Memorial evacuee, quote, "Did an angel of death stalk the halls of Memorial Medical there in Louisiana?" End quote. When someone started talking about the delayed rescue, no power, their fear, and just generally trying to be serious and gain sympathy, Nancy cut them off and said, quote, "I don't want to relive Katrina. I want to find out if there was an angel of death stalking the halls of Memorial Medical. That's what I want to find out." End quote. When Dr. Bryant King appeared on her show, she said, quote, "I find it fantastical in this case, and in many others, where witnesses can lead you up to the brink of an alleged crime, and then suddenly they turn away. They leave the room. Here they're saying that there's a doctor with a handful of syringes with liquid in it, saying this will make you all feel better to patients, but they don't know what happened after that. I would have been doing a backflip to see what was going on." End quote. When media conglomerates reported a family filing suit against Memorial for the death of a loved one, doctors and nurses alike came to defend their colleagues. Dr. John Kokemore was one of them. When Life Care Nursing Director Gina Isbell was interviewed by investigators, she didn't want to get anyone in trouble. The investigation actually made her angry. The angle of the news coverage made her angrier. To her, everyone at Memorial was a hero. The criminals were the government. Why had it taken them so long to help them? That's why those lives were lost. The doctors who tried to take away people's pain should be seen as heroes in her eyes, not villains. Gina blamed the government because Life Care had the resources to come in and get people out, but believed the government dissuaded company executives from sending help. Gina felt guilty about every staff member she picked to work the hurricane with her. If any Memorial employees were being more forthcoming at first, after a day in October, they weren't. Memorial medical personnel received an email telling them to feel free to speak to the hospital's lawyer, Audrey Andrews, if they were contacted by the media or the government. If they decided to be interviewed by the government or media, they can request a hospital representative appear with them. It's not appropriate to publicly talk about what happened, and the hospital requested that they don't talk about what happened with people not employed by Memorial, and even others that were. This memo followed a 3-day media binge of staff talking to media, including one British tabloid interview with The Mail on Sunday where a female doctor at an unnamed hospital said something like, quote, "I didn't know if I was doing the right thing, but I did not have time. I had to make snap decisions under the most appalling circumstances, and I did what I thought was right. I injected morphine into those patients who were dying and in agony. If the first dose was not enough, I gave a double dose. And at night, I prayed to God to have mercy on my soul. This was not murder. This was compassion. They would have been dead within hours, if not days. We did not put people down. What we did was give comfort to the end." End quote. That compassion and not murder sentiment was something many of Memorial and Life Care staff that were present or participated in patient euthanasia felt like they did. And that's exactly what the employee line was for any employees that spoke to the hospital lawyer before their interviews with investigators. There were a lot of "I can't recalls," and "they probably weren't going to make it," and "I heard a rumor" responses that made it clear that they had been coached on what to say. Even if those same people had openly told journalists the hospital was euthanizing and putting people to sleep. Subpoenas had to be issued to get witnesses back in front of investigators and move the quickly stalling investigation along. A New Orleans attorney that Tenet hired, Eddie Casting, ended up representing most of Memorial's employees and being present during their interviews. In November, he approached Virginia, Butch, and their supervisor asking for immunity for nurses Lori Boudreaux and Mary Jo D'Amico. Allegedly, during this meeting, it was said one of his clients was on the 7th floor when injections were made for the purpose of mercy killing and participated with the doctor in administrating morphine and Versed. 2 other nurses were also present, but Eddie did not represent those nurses. He believed he could get those 2 to come in and talk if they were offered immunity too. Eddie also said Life Care hospital personnel were there right after or during the injections and knew what was happening. He said his client came back to the 2nd floor after leaving the 7th and witnessed the same thing happening with a male doctor present in the area with patients labeled as 3s. The patients doctors felt were most ill, those with do not resuscitate or DNR orders, and voted to evacuate last by doctors. Eddie said his other client was asked to go up to the 7th floor later where one patient was still alive, and that's where they saw Dr. Anna Poe inject that patient. Now, this was news for investigators. All previous testimony by personnel had mentioned 2 nurses being with and possibly helping Anna during the patient injections, but now Virginia and Butch knew there were 3 nurses that participated and a 4th that witnessed the act. But they couldn't exactly do a lot with the information. The Attorney General's office were the ones investigating potential murders. That office hadn't decided if they would be continuing with criminal charges or even if they would be prosecuting the healthcare workers accused of euthanasia. That was up to District Attorney Eddie J. Jordan Jr., since criminal proceedings were decided by local officials, and he had to decide if he would step aside and let the Attorney General's office prosecute after its investigation. It didn't appear he would step aside, though. To many, it was pretty clear he was keeping the case to himself. Even though reportedly his office was thought widely to be inept due to poor conviction rates before Katrina, post-Katrina, it didn't look promising. Staff in the Attorney General's office were told not to speak about the case to the district attorney's office. Now, even though the information the nurse's attorney came forward with further validated and strengthened the case in a way, it was a double-edged sword. It could not be used in any way to incriminate the nurses, even if confirmed from another source, unless they could prove they would have discovered it through a natural and alternate way during the investigation. They couldn't accept Eddie's client's offer of testimony for immunity to use the information in their case that way because the investigators couldn't guarantee anyone with full immunity. It wasn't their case to prosecute. It was up to District Attorney Eddie Jordan Jr. Apparently, years after this, Eddie Casting, the nurse's attorney, would deny that he asked for immunity because, quote, "immunity means you did something wrong and you're immunized for it. I never made any admission like that," end quote. He specifically denied that he said anything about what allegedly happened on the 2nd and 7th floors. He said he did not keep notes on the meeting, even though Virginia and Butch's office did. Eddie claimed they already had those facts, and the investigators told him as much. He claimed it didn't make sense for him to go in there and tell them all this incriminating stuff and then say, "You can't prosecute." Mary Jo D'Amico one of the alleged nurses seen aiding in patient injections, got an attorney that told prosecutors what Mary would say if given immunity from prosecution in the case. The lawyer wrote a letter saying the offer was made off the record and could not be used against Mary directly or derivatively. Among other things, the attorney had also reached out to the feds, who still had a case open on Memorial. After meeting with a U.S. attorney to see what federal statutes might apply, it was determined federally the most they could do was charge certain physicians with inappropriately prescribing narcotics, but that only carried a 5-year sentence. It was better to go after them within the bounds of local law, which could go after them for murder, among other things. Going after alleged murderers for murder in Louisiana was a much more fitting and hefty punishment than illegal prescription prescribing, comparatively like grabbing a mob boss on tax evasion charges. They aren't charged for whatever number of criminal offenses, but you can get them for tax evasion. No 25 to life in prison, but they'll get like 10 years max. And then out early on good behavior, or something like that. In December, a team including Virginia, Butch, and life care pharmacist Stephen Harris returned to Memorial Medical Center. During the 3 months since Katrina, all kinds of restoration workers and former employees had been in and out of the building. Doctors and staff returned to get their personal belongings and medical records. When Stephen returned with Virginia and Butch and the team of investigators, they wanted to get his confirmation of medications. Stephen confirmed that his entire stock of morphine was missing, as well as dozens of Ativan and Versed injection vials. Now, they knew the pharmacy had not been burglarized since they had to use a battering ram to break in months prior, and because the pharmacy had clearly been selectively taken from. Other controlled drugs were still there. Ones that were more likely to be taken had someone come in to steal them. There at the same time were Dr. Anna Poe, along with nurses Cherry Landry and Lori Boudreau, touring the hospital with a tenant attorney. Allegedly, they appeared to be walking the attorney through their actions around the time of the patient injections. As interviews with family members of the alleged euthanized patients and reports continued to stay present in the news cycle, Dr. Anna Poe was asked to stop performing surgery on her patients. Because she was still employed in the Louisiana State University health system and performing head and neck surgery on cancer patients during this time, it just wouldn't look great if a patient happened to die during surgery. It would have opened up a whole new can of worms. Now, as far as the rest of the evidence before the trial, the coroner reports, other expert opinions, etc., it gets interesting, to say the least. The coroner, Frank Minyard, was actually a gynecologist, allegedly because Frank was a gyno and not trained to interpret the toxicology reports. Among other things, a forensic pathologist was brought in. Well, at least not trained enough for the prosecutor to feel certain enough of Frank's conclusions. That pathologist was Cyril Wetch. He worked the John F. Kennedy assassination and the O.J. Simpson murder trial. After reviewing 4 cases, Cyril decided that the morphine contributed to the deaths of those patients. Morphine wasn't ordered for them, so why was it in their system? Especially considering the patients were severely compromised to begin with. According to Cyril, when considering both of those points, any amount of morphine found is significant. But prosecutor Butch Schaefer wanted to know if the amounts in the patients was considered significant to Cyril. Could the doses have just been therapeutic, meant to soothe the patients? Cyril would get back to Butch later, after cross-referencing other sources, and say that in all 4 of those cases, he was asked to check out a lethal amount of morphine was administered. Cyril's conclusion was the extra evidence they needed to prosecute Dr. Anna Poe, Cherry Landry, and Lori Boudreau, but they still needed more to really solidify their case. When looking back through the testimonies, it was clear that even life care staff had in fact held back on what they witnessed fellow staff and Memorial employees do post-Katrina. So Butch confronted life care attorneys about what he suspected was held back or left out, and the attorneys would of course respond saying that Butch didn't ask the questions that would get the answer he was looking for. The life care staff that came forward answered what was asked of them, but they didn't say a word more. The next round of questions of life care staff from Butch focused more so on what happened to 380-pound paraplegic life care patient Emmett Everett. To prevent any confusion, since I've described two patients who were described as being 300 plus pounds and being considered too heavy to be moved, Rodney Scott was the memorial patient. He was not paralyzed in any way, to my understanding, and he was the one who was evacuated. Emmett Everett was a life care patient, and he was paraplegic. And he was not evacuated. Both men were awake and talking and fine while they were in memorial. Terrence Stalin, a respiratory therapist at Life Care, would say that he spoke with Emmett when volunteers were taking life care patients downstairs for evacuation. Terrence recalled Emmett calling him into his room to shake his hand and thank Terrence for all that life care staff had done for him. Afterward, Terrence would be told that volunteers would not carry Emmett downstairs because he was too heavy. Terrence would confess to Butch and Virginia that he found it hard to believe Emmett was too heavy to carry with a group of helpers. He even mentioned the big flat roof next to the 7th floor where they could have just knocked out a window like they were doing all over the rest of the hospital. He said they could have just passed Emmett through that window and taken him to the helicopter pad. It doesn't appear investigators really hounded him for more information as far as the details of why that wasn't done or suggested, or if it was suggested and just ignored and chosen not to be done. But then investigators moved on to asking Terrence about the smaller patients left on the 7th floor. Why were they left and not carried downstairs if weight was in fact the issue with Emmett? Terrence said he believed that those smaller patients were abandoned because they were old ladies seen as expendable. Someone decided that they had no quality of life because they had Alzheimer's or dementia. Terrence would reveal that after he was taken to the boat drop-off point after being told to leave by a possible National Guardsman on September 1st, again, people seem to be confused on if people giving orders were police officers, National Guardsmen, actual people in charge of telling others what to do. People just seem to go with the flow and follow whatever orders they were told. But Terrence said that he saw the infectious disease doctor that came to the life care floor the day before, the one that told life care nurses to give a small injection of Ativan and morphine to any agitated or restless patients, and that gave Wilda McManus that DNR order. Terrence saw that doctor at the boat drop-off point, and he asked her what she thought might become of the 7th floor patients. What would happen to them? According to Terrence, the doctor started crying and said staff still at the hospital were going to help those patients find their way to heaven. The infectious disease doctor later denied that the exchange ever happened. Another interview with Diane Robichaud, LifeCare's incident commander, who had her baby by this point of the investigation, revealed more on the decision surrounding Emmett Everett. Diane revealed that on the morning of September 1st, she and Christy Johnson, the physical medicine director, brainstormed how to get Emmett out of the hospital. When they went to check on him in his room, he told them he felt a little dizzy and suggested that he might need oxygen or something. Diane told him he was already hooked up to oxygen and his window was open to let air flow through. Emmett asked if they were ready to get him out, and Diane told him they were working on it. A bit later is when the conversation with Diane, Dr. Anna Poe, and others happened that caused Andre Grimion to leave in tears after they suggested Andre use his familiarity with Emmett to sedate him. Andre would reveal that the reason he was so upset, even though they just asked him to sedate Emmett, was because he remembered Anna telling him that if he didn't feel comfortable, not to do it, because it would come back to haunt him. Anna told him the first time she did it, she wasn't ready and it haunted her for 2 years. That conversation, those statements, made him think that they were going to give Emmett something to let him go. Christy Johnson, the physical medicine director, came forward weeks later saying that she had been walking with Dr. Anna Poe to Emmett's room when Anna told Christy she planned to tell Emmett she was going to give him something for his dizziness. Christy said Anna was so nervous she had never seen a physician as nervous as her in that moment, to the point where Christy asked Anna if she was going to be okay and if Anna wanted her to go into Emmett's room with her. Anna turned Christy's offer down before leaving Christy at the room entrance when she closed the door behind her while she joined Emmett in his room. Christy would admit to being present for some of the injections, literally there because she held some of the patient's hands and said prayers during the lethal injections. She saw Anna pulling fluids from vials into syringes. Christy said she saw Anna and memorial nurses carrying syringes in their hands. Christy, the person who told Wilda McManus's daughter, Angela, who was practically forced to leave her mother, that they would do everything for Wilda, was there when Anna injected Wilda. Christy looked right into Wilda's eyes as Anna injected her and recalled thinking Wilda was really fighting as she went in and out of consciousness. Allegedly, Anna told her later that she had to give Wilda 3 doses. Christy went with a taller memorial nurse into the room of Alice Hutzler and Rose Savoy. Alice, who was the perky patient considering her multiple health issues, but only in the hospital at that time due to bed sores and pneumonia contracted at her nursing home, and she was expected to be fine. Rose was one of her 2 roommates. Both women were reportedly alert and stable that morning, and Rose even commented that the injection burned as her arm turned puffy. Both Rose and Alice would be among the 9 injected life care patients that did not leave the floor alive. Dr. John Skinner, Memorial's pathologist in charge of keeping track of patient deaths during the storm, and his lab director, David Heitkamp, came forward with more information. They were walking through the hospital to write down the names of the dead and their locations, among other things, when they saw Dr. Anna Poe and nurse manager Mary Jo D'Amico. The pair were beside a patient believed to be Wilda McManus when Dr. John Skinner saw Anna messing with the patient's IV, trying to get it to work, before just injecting them with a syringe into the thigh. The patient had been experiencing labored breathing during that time, so John pulled Anna aside to tell her that he thought the patient was still alive and that they should evacuate her. John said he wanted to go get appropriate help and find someone to help carry the woman. Anna asked John and David if one of them could go to the helipad and tell the doctors in charge there that one more patient still needed to be evacuated. David left to do that. Meanwhile, John went with Anna into the room of an African-American female patient where Anna tried to get that woman's IV to work while asking John if he thought the patient was still alive. She barely was, and John noticed a cardboard box filled with syringes, tubing, and gloves among some vials. The vials were labeled morphine. Anna moved the patient into the hallway before John and Anna went downstairs when Anna said she wanted to talk to an anesthesiologist. They ran into John Walsh instead, the chairman of surgical services. Anna was visibly upset, so John Walsh asked what was wrong, and Anna mentioned a patient dying or some people questioning her, something like that. A life care nurse by the name of Cindy Shallaton remembered Dr. John Skinner telling her that the situation in the hospital was grave on the morning of September 1st. Cindy said he told her that there were not any more resources to get the 9 life care patients on that floor out and that they wouldn't make it because they had do not resuscitate orders. Cindy told him, actually, at least one of those patients don't have a DNR. She told him the one she was aware of not being a DNR was just extremely obese. The doctor believed by Cindy to be Dr. John Skinner said that the helicopters couldn't take a patient of his weight and that the law of nature would take over. Only the strong would survive the situation and that Mother Nature's course would have to be hastened. Years later, Dr. John Skinner would deny being the doctor Cindy spoke to. The comments didn't sound anything like something he would say at all. It's hard to know if Cindy identified the right person or to fully trust it because she was the nurse that was put on probation by the nursing board 2 weeks before the storm. The one battling narcotics addiction just got her license back and was supposed to work in a restrictive environment but was working pretty much on her own, minus a little help from her teenage daughter. The same one that allegedly gave Wilda McManus Ativan after giving herself morphine after being left unsupervised with the drugs when she should not have been. Speaking with Susan Muldrick again, revealed to investigators that the idea to medicate patients that morning actually came from her, although she claims her intentions were only to provide patients comfort. Her assertion about that being her intention was suspect, though, because when they looked through the pharmacy, prescriptions were found that revealed Ativan and other typically prescribed comfort medications had already been prescribed for those patients by Anna and other doctors all throughout the disaster. It didn't really make sense that Anna would need to speak to Dr. Ewing Cook, as suggested by Susan. But as suspect and coached as Susan's interview responses were to this follow-up, at least it was obvious she knew what was happening in Memorial after Katrina. Allegedly, between CEO Renee Gu, CFO Curtis Dosh, and COO Sean Fowler, the men selfishly kept their heads beneath the sand while patients died and were euthanized. They revealed that the Cancer Institute that was connected to Memorial by a sky bridge, the one I said Dr. Ewing Cook's daughter wanted to take her dog to get oxygen after it fell sick, and before Ewing put him down, that one. Well, it turns out those hospital executives went there to make phone calls and get coffee. They watched TV, they had fans, recliners, found chicken noodle soup that they were able to microwave because the Institute had electricity throughout the entire disaster. Its generators worked fine. Curtis Dosh made coffee for the nurses, gave fans to those on the second floor, all sorts of things. He didn't keep the goodies all to himself. But it boggles the mind, why did they not put patients onto rolling gurneys and take them into the clearly more comfortable Cancer Institute? Why weren't they taken into the air-conditioned cars and trucks that the staff were regularly escaping to? Why hadn't Curtis Dosh come clean to investigators that he saw a doctor inject a patient on the second floor, or tell them that he saw a chief nursing officer crying, or that he had to ask CEO Renee if they knew what was happening? Curtis revealed he didn't realize what a big deal the whole thing would turn into until he got home to find 2 major media reporters on his property. But while he was clueless to what this would blow up into, the nurses had a feeling it would, because they went into the cone of silence. Don't talk about it, but also nothing happened to not talk about. In the background of all of this, it's alleged that corruption and or shady back-scratching was going on. But I'll get into that after I explain a bit more. At some point in 2006, following the hot mess at Memorial, doctors and staff came together for a crawfish boil. To Memorial internal medicine specialist, Dr. Horace Bolts, it reminded him of a wake. It felt like a funeral and a festival in one. The main hospital had been closed since the storm. Many Memorial employees went to work on other campuses or were working from outpatient offices in the complex, minus those that were technically employed under other businesses, like Anna with LSU. But there, Horace noticed a lot of what he described as racially prejudiced verbal attacks towards the notably absent Dr. Bryant King for his outspokenness on the news. Memorial employees present claimed he was a troublemaker for not going with the, quote, team. Horace didn't hear a word from anyone trying to figure out what might have happened to the patients after Katrina, though. Almost like they knew what really happened and were just mad that Bryant opened his mouth publicly. On Monday, July 27th, 2006, Dr. Anna Poe and nurses Cherry Landry and Lori Boudreau were arrested for second-degree murder by intentionally killing 4 patients. 89-year-old Aretha Watson, who had dementia and was being treated for gangrenous toes, 66-year-old Hollis Alford, who had a history of schizophrenia and was suffering from a blood infection, Emmett Everett, the 380-pound patient, and Rose Savoy, one of the 2 alert elderly female roommates, the one who said it burned after being injected. There was some back and forth in the Attorney General's office over what to actually charge the healthcare workers with. Someone wanted first-degree murder charges brought, but the idea was shot down because the thought of prosecuting healthcare professionals who worked through Hurricane Katrina with first-degree murder would not go over well at all. Already, the mention of investigating them in the news for second-degree murder had led to an influx of angry letters from the public who thought they knew the truth of what happened but clearly didn't, or just didn't care. Besides, second-degree murder in Louisiana at the time allowed a life sentence of hard labor without parole. First-degree murder only put the death penalty on the table, something that everyone felt was too extreme for what happened. Someone suggested manslaughter instead, making it a sudden passion murder case, suggesting that there was no intent to kill, and the maximum sentence for that would be 40 years in jail. They went with second-degree murder charges. Anna was released after signing property bonds and other agreements just after midnight, technically the next day after being arrested. As news of the arrests made waves internationally, everyone chimed in, from the couch warriors who felt like doctors were in the right to euthanize patients because they believed they themselves would want to be killed if they were in a 100-plus degree hospital with no AC. There were people blaming relatives of the euthanized, like, why weren't you in the hospital with your loved ones? Clearly, those commenters were unaware that there were relatives there, and that didn't save those patients from being euthanized. But there were doctors and professionals who worked the storm in other hospitals that questioned exactly what the Memorial doctors were doing. One said, quote, "Our whole purpose for being here was to aid the patients, not to kill them because we wanted them out of our misery," end quote. Bringing it back to the idea that the patients were euthanized not for their own good, not that those were the doctors' calls to make to begin with, but because of how it affected Memorial physicians. How could the doctors decide for the patients if they were suffering enough to put them out of their suffering without their express consent, without say from family members even, especially considering they weren't familiar with the patients, and in many cases, those that were allegedly euthanized were not suffering. They had health conditions that allowed them to not be able to communicate their needs easily, but they weren't requiring being permanently put to sleep. Like Essie Cavalier, who could only communicate by yelling "mama," and only in the hospital because after having her UTI treated, the nursing home she was heading back to couldn't take her because they were evacuating. She wasn't even close to requiring euthanasia, but doctors knowing nothing about her decided her quality of life wasn't good. I guess good enough to warrant saving. I honestly don't know how else to put it. Some nurses would support Dr. Anna Poe's choices, though, saying that they saw doctors order lethal doses of IV medication to be given every hour to cause death. Other non-medical professionals were horrified to see just how many healthcare professionals granted themselves the authority to kill when they were upset. One doctor in Kansas City even said, quote, "Might we all make questionable judgments if we're hungry, dehydrated, and sleep-deprived?" End quote. In the news, coworkers and family members of Dr. Anna Poe came to her and the nurse's defense. People who knew Dr. Anna Poe as a healthcare worker but were not at Memorial and had not been told by her or anyone else what really happened refused to believe she did what was being said in the news. Her department chairman at LSU Healthcare, Dr. Daniel Ness, said he felt the agenda against Anna was a political one. Dan got together with Anna's attorney and pooled support. He organized a legal defense fund, the Anna Poe MD Defense Fund, under the idea that this sort of thing could happen to any healthcare professional on call when a disaster happened. Anna's defense was not covered by malpractice insurance due to the criminal allegations, so her personal assets and professional reputation were at risk. The letter and email campaign paid off, though. Within 1 week, they had raised around $30,000 for the fund. It was used for her legal defense and the defense of her reputation. And boy, did they get to work. The goal was to make the image painted of Dr. Anna Poe so radiant and wonderful that the allegations would just fade away. They would destroy the reputation of the Attorney General going after her and any reporters trying to learn the truth behind the charges. Partners of the New Orleans Public Relations Agency took on Anna's case and made sure Anna herself stayed out of the public eye while others went to bat for her in the media. Nurses who were at Memorial were worried about who could be targeted next. An internet page was made that included the claim that the rescue helicopters and boats showed up too late and too little in number to save their patients. And that's what the true crime was. Nurses Sherry Landry and Lori Boudreaux were heroes, not criminals. Memorial Surgical ICU nurse Kathy Green was one of the people very publicly outspoken. Coworkers like Dr. Ewing Cook were subpoenaed for interviews. He wanted to speak on Anna's behalf to investigators, but his lawyer, one of the city's top criminal lawyers, told him to keep his mouth shut. Ewing told his attorney he wanted to explain to investigators how bad the situation was in Memorial, how they felt they might not get out alive and that the sick had even less of a chance, so they felt desperate. His lawyer clearly told him to never say such a thing again. Ewing should not want to talk to them. Absolutely nothing he had to say would help in any way whatsoever. And by the way, don't talk to any reporters that may show up either. Ewing felt like it could have been him arrested too. The tables could have been turned if the nurses that were with him when he euthanized Janie Burgess had mentioned him or those activities at all. They protected him. Janie was the segregation-era nurse described as having light brown skin that he euthanized. I mean, doesn't Ewing's statement all but admit to what they were being accused of? They were so desperate to leave Memorial that they euthanized patients to save themselves, and maybe because they felt they were doing patients a favor? Now, District Attorney Eddie Jordan Jr. asked for the coroner's classifications of the 4 patient deaths prior to presenting the case that the women were arrested for to a grand jury for indictments. Until this point, Coroner Frank Minyard had kept most of the patient death certificates from Memorial and Life Care labeled as pending investigation or a handful labeled as accident. A few said Hurricane Katrina related deaths, though. The vagueness, of course, did nothing to help families get help from insurance with claims and things of that nature, but now was time to put labels on it, for real. Frank was joined by Dr. Cyril Wetch, the forensic pathologist who determined that they were homicides due to a high level of suspicious drugs in the victim's systems, and another known forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden. All 3 men got together to evaluate the evidence, and the director of the toxicology lab that tested the autopsy samples for the medications was there too to present the results and work with the men as well. Now, remember I said Dr. Anna Poe and nurses Sherry Landry and Lori Boudreau were only arrested for the 4 deaths? Well, 23 of the 41 bodies from Memorial and Life Care that were examined tested positive for morphine, midazolam, or both. Now, the director of the toxicology lab who handled thousands of cases to this point felt that the numbers found in those people were high. But still, when testing postmortem tissue, you have to consider things differently than blood tests from living patients. You have to consider individual patient history as well with the lab results. So they went through the 9 patients on Life Care's floor that were found with the drugs in their system, all who had been listed alive that morning on paperwork, but dead by afternoon. Those whose medical chart had been kept up to date until mere hours before they were recorded dead, like Alice Hutzler, who was there for pneumonia. All the men at this meeting determined homicide was the cause of death for 8 of those 9 patients without a doubt. The only one they were torn on and marked as undetermined was Elaine Nelson, Catherine's mother. One of the guys believed that she was considered a homicide too, but since her records marked her as close to death prior to her actually dying, it couldn't be known for sure and just wasn't a strong enough case. When looking at those 8th floor patients, Janie Burgess was suspicious, but not a strong enough case, legally speaking, in a courtroom. Her chart showed that she was given 15 milligrams of morphine 7 times on Wednesday within less than an hour and a half time period, based on spoken orders from Dr. Ewing Cook. The amount was more than 5 times the maximum amount Janie had ever been given in an entire day during her hospitalization. Anytime she was given morphine, it was as needed for pain and usually only 2 to 4 times a day. At the very most, if she was given multiple doses a day, it was never more than once an hour, and the most she had ever gotten prior to this was 6 milligrams. As for the 2nd floor, as far as 9 of those patients went, every one of them, plus Merle Lagasse, tested positive for at least midazolam, with a majority having morphine in their system along with it. Those 9 included the 3 Dr. Anna Poe wrote that large morphine prescription for, even though 2 of those 3 were of the minority that only had midazolam in their system. One of those 3 who Anna wrote the prescription for, an engaged mother of 4, 41-year-old Donna Cotham, was said to have severe liver disease, but her body didn't have much evidence of that. She had a needle wound in her left arm. The patient who had a stroke that left her only able to say a few words, including mama, and didn't have anything severe going on with her, Essie Cavalier, she also had high levels of morphine and midazolam in her system. Essie's death, along with many of the second-floor patients' deaths, were marked as likely homicides pending further review of hospital records because Tenet still had not turned over many Memorial patient records. They gave them most of Life Care's, but Memorial, their actual company that they owned, nope. The charts were just nowhere to be found. Tenet alleged maybe the information was transported with the bodies, but Memorial employees said the records weren't taken or brought in with those bodies. It's believed about 5 of the 45 bodies found may have died before the storm. And they found 7 stillborn remains, but those weren't counted in that 45, and I don't think they were looked into or considered as far as criminal investigations go. 5 adult remains didn't have toxicology done on them, including what was allegedly described as possibly being the woman Dr. Anna Poe was fumbling with the IV catheter in her arm that I described earlier. Now, it would be like 2 or so days before anyone showed up from the district attorney's office to see what was determined by those men. It was 2 assistant district attorneys that did show, though. The lead prosecutor with just 2 years of experience prosecuting homicides, Michael Morales, and his boss, ADA Craig Familero. The pathologist described both men as uninterested, skeptical, and suspicious of what they had to say. One went as far as to claim that it was obvious the prosecutors didn't want to actually do any work. They only stayed to listen to the pathologist for about 30 minutes. At the time of this meeting, Coroner Frank Minyard agreed with the other 2 pathologists that many deaths at Memorial Medical Center were homicides. It was the pattern. Almost everyone who died did so after boats and helicopters showed up on Thursday morning and, when tested, were positive for the drugs. As the first anniversary of Hurricane Katrina made its way around, the hospital was planning to reopen under new leadership, so staff gathered together. There, Dr. Horace Bolts heard a few things. After the storm, Horace heard doctors talk about convincing the nurses to go along with the plan and not thinking that they could get all the nurses to go along with it. He didn't think much of that overheard conversation at the time until, obviously, it came out that so many patients were found dead. And now, those same doctors that were having that discussion were aiming to be part of hospital staff leadership. He heard another talking about his efforts to make sure the Attorney General lost in the next election, allegedly for his investigation. And no one would breathe a word of what happened in the halls of Memorial the year before. Unlike what appears to be many of his colleagues, Horace was not about the cover-up life, though. He felt his ethics clearly just didn't align with the rest of his colleagues, who had no problem covering up what happened. Dr. Horace Bolts chose to resign after 40 years working at Memorial because of this. As it was before this, when he first saw the news of Sherry Landry and Lori Boudreau being arrested in the news, he called Lori's mother, who he felt was a good nurse herself. He offered to be a character witness for them in court if needed. Horace was called by another Memorial nurse, later asking him to speak at a press conference on behalf of the nurses, and he actually agreed. He just wanted assurance that the nurses were being honest with authorities, because he had heard Life Care employees admit themselves to their part in the euthanasia acts, and they were truthful with law enforcement. The Memorial nurse he was speaking to on the phone told him they couldn't do the same because Tenet was paying for their attorneys. Horace would never stop thinking about that conversation he heard on September 1st in the doctor's office. Since the 1-year anniversary was coming up, and thus the cutoff for when lawsuits could be filed, many attorneys searched for patient families whose cases they could take, those who died during their stay at Memorial and those who didn't. Merle Lagasse's daughter, Karen, who I called Kay, still didn't know what happened to her mother at this point. She thought her mother died from Dr. Roy Cullada's negligence and sued him, among others. Essie Cavalier, the patient who would say mama to communicate, well, her daughter was actually a medical malpractice attorney and sued Memorial too. Seeing her mother's toxicology report was depressing, to say the least. Essie's daughter wondered, where are the checks and balances that would have stopped someone from being able to decide for Essie that she wasn't going to make it? As families from euthanized patients got their hands on toxicology reports, arrest affidavits, and everything else, they filed civil suits against the doctors and nurses they felt were involved, including the pharmacist, Stephen Harris in some cases, the hospital, and LSU, since that was Anna's employer. And for some, the families whose family member may have been euthanized but didn't qualify as being able to say that for one reason or another, they felt robbed. For those who may not have had much time left, it still hurt to know that whatever they could have had was cut short, allegedly because of doctors playing God. By February 2007, New Orleans had Mardi Gras going again, even though the city and those who survived Katrina were far from truly recovered. But it was around this time that ADA Michael Morales had convened a grand jury for an unusual purpose. He was going to use the grand jury as an investigative tool instead of presenting the evidence to jurors in order to get an indictment, as they traditionally did. The jurors would act as investigators with the DA's office and decide what evidence they wanted to consider. The district attorney's office would prepare a 10-count indictment against Dr. Anna Poe for the grand jury to consider. 9 counts of conspiracy to commit second-degree murder for each of the 7th floor life care patients, including Emmett Everett, and 1 count of second-degree murder for Emmett Everett, whose cause of death, the way he really is alleged to have died, I haven't said yet. But the grand jury declined to indict Dr. Anna Poe on every single charge. Now, how and why this happened is, in my opinion, no mistake or accident. Like I said, allegedly there was collusion behind the scenes. In my opinion, there was definitely cowardice, willful ignorance, and sloppy work on the part of many who should have been worried about getting justice. And honestly, Anna's lawyer was a beast behind the scenes and capitalized on the lazy work. I hate to toot his horn, but his work is allegedly why not only Memorial euthanasia victims did not get justice, but why victims killed in other healthcare facilities didn't either, which I'll explain in the next part. It's also ridiculous. But the guy put in the work. As for nurses Sherry Landry, Lori Boudreau, and another one who didn't manage to escape getting dragged into things but did not regret her choices for a single minute, even Dr. John Thiel, who was involved, and I haven't said how yet. I'll get to all of that in the next part because otherwise this part would have been decades long, because that part was supposed to be part of this, but it would just be way too long. So the next part is really like part 3.5, and I might actually call it that. But until then, stay safe, subscribe or follow if you haven't already, leave your thoughts, and I'll be back next Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.